Good morning, everyone. I'm Cleo Tarazi, and I'm joined with my fellow Master Gardener, Leslie Hart, and we will be acting as moderators today. A few housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar platform. A webinar platform, which means that your audio and video is not available. And if you would kindly put the questions in the Q&A box, then Leslie and I will moderate the questions. Some questions we can answer directly, and others we will be presenting to the panelists. As a follow-up, we will send a PDF with all the pertinent links to everyone who has registered and attended in an email. So look for that, and it will also send you the video recording link at that time. Welcome everyone from Sonoma, Marin, and throughout California and the West Coast. The Resilient Landscapes webinar is in conjunction with the Eco-Friendly Garden Tour sponsored by the Sonoma Marin Water Agency. The Eco-Friendly Garden Tour is a public outreach and education program that promotes sustainable landscaping by showcasing inspiring gardens throughout Sonoma and Marin counties. The tour highlights Russian River-friendly and Bay-friendly landscape best practices and supports qualified water-efficient landscapers certified by professionals featuring their personal or clients' gardens. Make sure you check out the videos of the gardens for inspiration. Today's webinar panel will provide some basic information and hopefully inspiration on how to build a resilient garden in our time of climate fluctuations, droughts, and wildfires. Our gardens, as some of us realized during this past year, and many have for lifetimes, are a source of joy, gratification, and part of our environment that we should nurture. As Doug Ptolemy says, gardens are nature's best hope. How do we apply sustainable practices, work within our climate, and create space where plants can thrive and provide habitat? How do we manage to create resilient landscapes within our current conditions? Experienced or new gardeners are all having to rethink many of our gardening practices. Luckily, many people have dedicated their lives' work into helping us in this effort. Writers, advisors, scientists, and landscape professionals, as you will see from our panelists. Our panelists each will give us a unique and informative perspective that can help you in building a resilient garden and rethink our role as gardeners. As Saxon-Holt says, each little change we make matters. Our first panelist will be Paul Piazza, the Water Conservation Manager from Sonoma Water, and the host of this project, of this whole endeavor. He will start with introduction of the bad news. Then Carrie Reed will be the first speaker. Carrie is an area environmental horticulture advisor for the University of California Cooperative Extension in San Joaquin, Sacramento, Solano, and Yolo counties, where she serves at public agencies and the professional landscape nursery industries with applied research, education, and consultation. Carrie has been performing irrigation-based plant performance research. So this is where we bring in the scientists. Since 2005, the UC landscape plant irrigation trials at the UC Davis campus and new rose cultivar trials with the American Rose Trials for Sustainability for the last 4 years at San Joaquin County Agricultural Center. Saxon-Holt is a photojournalist who seeks out sustainable agricultural and horticultural best practices and focuses on ways we can harmonize with nature. He lives in gardens in Oak Madrone Woodland in Marin County. He has published over 30 books, and his most recent Gardening in Summer Dry Climates, he co-authored with Nora Harlow. Saxon is a board member of the Pacific Horticulture Society and is affiliated with a number of botanical gardens. Finally, Mimi Enright, my colleague and friend, is the coordinator of the UC Master Gardener Program of Sonoma County, was born and raised in the Bay Area, and has spent many happy days as a child exploring the Santa Cruz Mountains. She worked in the technology industry for 17 years before moving to Sonoma County in 2000 to pursue her passion as a garden designer. Mimi completed Sustainable MBA with a concentration in food systems in 2014. Who knew that would come handy? She has been at the University of California Cooperative Extension, Sonoma County since 2013 in a dual role as the Master Gardener Program Coordinator and Program Manager, focusing on community-based food systems with a particular focus on food waste reduction and increased food recovery. Mimi completed also the Master Gardener Training Program in 2011 and is a dauntless dedicated educator to Sonoma County gardeners for practices in sustainable and science-based gardening. Thank you to the panelists for coming together to put this expert webinar, and I will turn over the screen to Paul Piazza. I just wanted to let everybody know to make sure to go to the eco-friendly also afterwards too. So I will turn over the screen to Paul. Thank you, Paul.
All right, well, thank you all for joining this morning. Great to have you all part of the webinar. Wanted to send a shout out to Cleo, Mimi, and Leslie at UC Master Gardeners for pulling this together as a great feature to have as part of the annual Eco-Friendly Garden Tour. And also thanks to Saxon Holt and Carrie Reed for joining us and bringing some of their expertise as well. So I am one of a couple today presenting on some of the key reasons for pursuing resilient landscapes. So I'm just going to provide a quick update on the current water supply conditions that are facing us. So if you haven't been following the news, the 2021 water year really is on par with the last drought of record in 76 and 77 in California. And consequently, Lake Sonoma and Lake Mendocino, which are primary water supply reservoirs for our area, are at historic lows for the spring, early summertime. And just so you know, Sonoma Water is doing a lot of work to help improve water supply situation. We have a number of tools at our disposal, whether it's pursuing changes to stream flow releases through petitions to the State Water Control Board. We have a unique role that we play in terms of forecast-informed reservoir operations, which is changing how the Army Corps does their business with maintenance of the flood pool of our reservoirs to maintain as much supply as possible. And then, of course, water use efficiency and water conservation always has a part to play to improve our water supply situation. So we have a very robust program through the Sonoma Marin Saving Water Partnership that I'll touch on in a little bit. As a reminder, Sonoma Water is a wholesale water supplier to water cities, towns, and districts from Windsor in the north to the southern part of our service area down in North Marin and Novato. We provide water to about 600,000 people through our customers, but within the entire watershed, there's probably another 100,000 people that rely on the Russian River for their water supply. And what's unique to the system is just that the Russian River serves as a natural pipeline, carrying water from Lakes Mendocino and Lake Sonoma to the well fields down in Mirabel near Forestville. And this is referred to as a riverbank filtration system. The water is naturally filtered through about 100 feet of alluvial sands and gravels. And aside from just a little bit of chlorine that's required by state law and a little bit of soda to balance the pH, that's all the treatment that the water goes through before it's provided to businesses and residents in our system. And this is one of the largest natural filtered systems in the world. We get a lot of visitors from around the country and other nations that are interested in how we do this and are willing or interested in trying to put this into place where they live. Just looking at Sonoma Water's transmission system, I mentioned we have two main water supply reservoirs, Lake Mendocino up in Ukiah and Mendocino County, and Lake Sonoma in Sonoma County. This water is again traveling through the Russian River or through Dry Creek into the Russian River before it is reaching our facilities down at Mirabel. And depicted up at the top right is one of our Wohler collectors. They're wells that are about 100 feet deep that have lateral intake pipes that help bring some of the groundwater that's naturally filtered up to go into the transmission system to serve our customers. And in the image, you'll see the dotted gray line that represents our transmission system. These are very large pipes. We refer to them as aqueduct. They're about 3 to 5 feet in diameter. And as you can see, they distribute water as far to the southeast as city of Sonoma and Valley of the Moon, and then down into North Marin and Novato as well. What's not depicted on the schematic are a series of storage tanks and booster pumps that help provide this water through a gravity-fed system and help it get to the end of the long pipeline. So just to give you visually a picture of where we're at this year, this graph represents cumulative rainfall through the last 45 years. These years are not chronological. They're representative again of the total rainfall received. So up in the Ukiah Valley area, which is the predominant watershed area that helps feed storage in the Lake Mendocino, you can see that we have the driest year on record in 1977 still, but close behind are the years 2020 and 2021. So again, not looking good this year. And that translates into storage at Lake Mendocino, which is depicted by the orange bar at the far left, which for this time of year is the historic low. Just looking at an actual image of the lake a couple of years ago in February, where we were having a number of atmospheric river storms impact our area, we had a full reservoir. We actually had a little bit of flooding on the lower river that year. But a short 2 years later, this picture from January, you can see that the storage at Lake Mendocino is very dire. One of the unique things about drought is that it affects different areas differently. And you know, you've probably seen the drought monitor report or map nationally that shows most of the West is in a dry period, but depending on where you live, what your local water supply sources are, it can affect you differently. So here represented is the cumulative rainfall for the Santa Rosa area. And although not quite as dire as up in the Ukiah Valley area, it's still very clear that year 2021 and 2020 were amongst the lowest in the last 35, 45 years. And then, of course, Lake Sonoma is seeing similar effects as Lake Mendocino. It's a much larger reservoir. We do have a little under 145,000 acre feet currently as of this portion of May. But nonetheless, heading into the dry summer months, we're a little bit concerned about the amount of water that's left. We're going to make it through this summer okay, but we're going to be needing everybody to reduce use and make sure that if we enter a third dry period, that we're going to have enough water to get through next year as well. This is another visual depiction of Lake Sonoma. If you've been to the Yorty Creek area just to the west of Cloverdale, there's a nice swimming area and boat ramp there for kayakers and others to launch boats. And again, the conditions in February of 2019 as compared to current, you would have to hike your kayak about 1/4 mile to find enough water to launch. And then, you know, we have, again, a number of tools that we utilize to help preserve water storage in the reservoirs, one of which is water use efficiency and conservation. So through the Sonoma Marin Saving Water Partnership, we have programs that offer water use efficiency training. We provide, you know, water saving devices and rebate programs. We have an award-winning education program, our water and energy education program. Provides training to over 10,000 school children annually in both the classroom and through field trips. Our Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper program is an award-winning training program for landscapers, both to share information about appropriate ways to utilize water resources effectively to maintain beautiful and healthy gardens, but also to help customers achieve what they need at their home in terms of keeping water use down in the landscape. And then, of course, we do an annual eco-friendly garden tour, which is what's happening this weekend. And all of that has been remarkable at reducing the regional water use. Back in the 90s, our gallon per capita for our area was about 160 gallons per person per day. Today, we're using about 113, which is about a 28% reduction over the target that the state set for our region to reach by 2020. So again, just to wrap up, we need everybody to help do their part to reduce water use this summer. We're incurring another drought of record in the last 2 years. We need to get through this summer and make sure that if we enter a third dry year, that we have enough water to get through that period as well. We have an outreach campaign called Drought is Here, Save Water. You probably will be seeing more of in the coming months. And I would encourage all of you to take advantage of some of the incentive programs that are available through our retail partners to help you convert higher water use landscapes to low water. For more information, I would encourage you to visit the Sonoma Water website, sonomawater.org. We have up-to-date water supply information, including another list of information about current events related to the current drought. And then the savingwaterpartnership.org website is a great opportunity to get information about ways to save. Links to our partners' website. We are going to be also launching an updated partnership webpage in the next couple of weeks that includes a new regional plant database. And I want to provide kudos to the UC Master Gardeners and Garden Sense consultants that help contribute information to the build out of that website. We're very excited to launch that. So that's all I have today. Again, thank you for joining for the Garden Sense and UC Master Gardeners Resilient Summer Dry Landscapes webinar, and hope you enjoy the tour today.
Thank you, Paul. Now we will go to Carrie. First of all, before we do that, I wanted to share the link to the eco-friendly garden tour. You can capture the image here, the QR image, and it will take you directly to the link to get to the eco-friendly garden tour, which starts today. Chad is here, who has put the whole tour together, and he was just reminding me. So now I will give it back to Carrie. Thank you, Carrie. Sorry.
Okay, so I have the fun of sharing with you sort of the basics of what it means to build a resilient garden. Resilient gardens, when we're talking about that, what we mean by it is this sort of the same thing that you would mean by sustainability, which is a term that gets used quite often. But so what we're looking for is a garden that thrives without excessive inputs. And that can mean water, fertilizers, labor, chemicals. But it also means weathering unexpected changes. So Paul mentioned things like our recurring droughts and our temperature change, which seems there are some big slow temperature changes, but then we also can get these real extremes where the temperature will swing unexpectedly, even an excessively warm May. You want a garden that can weather those unexpected changes. So it may be water availability or temperature, but it can also include pests, because we are a state that sits in a spot where we are constantly being bombarded with pests from outside our area. And resilient gardens can weather those kind of changes. It's a garden that's going to support biodiversity, but ultimately, maybe our key motivator is that it enhances the beauty of our home, our property values, and our sense of well-being when we have access to these beautiful and resilient gardens. So I'm going to talk about 5 keys, and I'm going to hit them at a really high level. So there's no way we can go in depth on any of the topics that we're talking about today, but we really want to spark your interest, spark your curiosity, and we hope that you will dig deeper after this in order to find ways to really implement the things that we're going to be sharing with you. So the first one that I want to talk about is building healthy soil. So we're going to build resilient gardens literally from the ground up. Then optimizing your water use, selecting the right plant for the right place, reducing or eliminating, ultimately eliminating pesticides is your goal. And then really establishing that garden for the long haul from the beginning with a few key practices that'll ensure the success of that garden. So let's talk about healthy soil. What do we mean by healthy soil? Well, the first key thing is that there is pore spaces within a healthy soil. So in these areas where we are in a subdivision or in an urban area, our soils have often been really compacted by the construction processes themselves, but also just by lack of care. And so you can get really compacted soils that don't have room for water and oxygen, and plant roots need both of those things. So a healthy soil is one that has these pore spaces. A good healthy soil typically also will have up to 5% organic matter as a part of that soil profile. So you've got the mineral part of it, the moisture part of it, but then you also have this organic matter, which comes from decomposed critters in the soil and from decomposed plants and plant roots and so on. So a really simple soil test can tell you what your organic matter percentage is. You can get some rather inexpensive tests from even big box stores, but you can also get a pretty inexpensive soil test performed by labs in your area. So one of the things you can do to create a healthy soil is to add compost. And I want to just put in a little caveat here that if you're going to be going for a strictly native landscape or one that uses a lot of plants from South Africa, adding compost may not be necessary because a lot of our native zones, plant zones, are actually really nutrient poor, and the plants themselves are adapted to that very mineral soil that has a low amount of organic matter because it doesn't accumulate on those soils where the plants evolved. And so it's really key to know, we'll talk about that in a minute, but it's really key to know what it is that you're going to be planting and planting. But a good compost, if you need to add some compost to your soil in order to loosen it up and get that breathability in there and to encourage the soil microbes that keep those pore spaces open, you want a good compost, and a good compost is going to be fully decomposed. You're not going to be able to recognize what it was before. So you don't want a bunch of big twigs and things in a good compost. And if you smell it, it's going to smell like a healthy forest floor. So I encourage you, if you're going to a garden center, to ask the attendants to open a bag for you. They're usually willing to cut open a single bag so that you can see and smell the product. You don't want it to smell like anything rotting. And you typically don't want it to smell too hot either. You don't want it to have too strong of a smell of ammonia because that can also be detrimental. So if you're going to buy it by the yard, go to a good landscape supply place, walk through the yard and actually examine the material, pick up a handful of it, give it a smell, make sure that what you're adding is a good, fully decomposed material. And if you're going to add it, as I said, it should smell good and earthy and not rotten. But in order for it to do any good, you can't just put a little light layer on it. You're going to have to actually add a significant amount of compost. And that means 3 inches into a foot of soil. You want to fully incorporate that into the soil down to a foot, minimum of 8 inches, depending on what you're working with. And what this is going to do is eliminate the need for fertilizing landscape plants. Now, if you're growing vegetables, that's different because you're constantly harvesting. But with landscape plants, you're not harvesting material, and the soil itself, if it's matched to the plants, should supply everything those plants need. So the next step then is to cover that healthy soil with some mulch. And it takes at least a 2-inch layer for that to be effective and reduce water loss from evaporation. But some of the other benefits of having a nice layer of mulch is that it moderates the soil temperature, and that reduces root stress. And plants with healthy, happy roots are happy plants and healthy plants. But an additional thing is that by keeping that soil temperature even, you create a healthy microbial population right at that interface as well. So those microbes in the soil are critical to health for the plants because they're breaking down the mineral materials in the soil particles, and they're breaking down the organic materials that are in there as well. And what they do then is release those nutrients to the plants, and they give off these, what we call humic acids, that actually act like the glue that keeps those pore spaces open and keep your plant roots happy. Additional benefits is that it reduces dust in a drip irrigated garden, and dust can often be detrimental to our beneficial insects. And a couple of more benefits that really affect our environment and our water systems is that it reduces erosion of the soil, particularly on slopes. And it also slows the water infiltration into the soil surface and protects it, keeps it from crusting up. And over time, those soil microbes are going to break down that mulch layer right at the soil surface and start to add some carbon back into the soil and create a really nice layer on the surface. Now, you don't need to pay for a perfectly sized, perfectly engineered mulch. You can actually really help local landfills by just finding people who are trimming trees in your area and having them divert some of the chipped material to your pickup truck bed. And most of the time, I have had lots of them just bring it and dump it in my driveway. And now you've got a free material. And there are some studies that show in the last 7 years or so, there were some studies done at the Morton Arboretum that showed that using fresh tree trimmings is actually more beneficial to trees than using either the really big, large bark chunks or using compost as a mulch layer because of the rate at which it breaks down and the way that the soil microbes are able to use that material. And don't think that you need to always clean out your leaf litter as well. A 5-inch leaf litter in November is only going to be about 1.5 inches, and especially in areas where it's not visible. This is a natural mulch that the plants themselves are adapted to their own leaf litter. And so this is a really healthy way to do that. And if you really don't like the look of it, you can always do a very light top dressing over this kind of leaf litter with something that you find more aesthetically acceptable. Now, there are some exceptions to mulching. One is that some plants, native plants or succulents, may prefer bare soil or a rock mulch to an organic layer. So you'll have to pay attention and check your resources. And if you're also trying to encourage native bees, leaving some areas of bare soil can provide space for some of our native ground nesting bees. Your water goals in a resilient landscape are first and foremost going to be to conserve water. Now, you don't have to have an ugly landscape. I love the phrase low water lush. There's a way to do this so that you can still have what feels like a lush landscape by using lower water plants. And I just want to say this quickly. If you are not using your turf grass lawn, you can eliminate it and still get nice green swaths with very low water using ground covers in those areas. The second most important thing is to optimize the irrigation systems that you have, and by setting your systems to schedule properly, maximizing your plant health. So optimizing your irrigation usually is going to mean converting planted beds to some sort of a drip irrigated system, because this is going to get you water at the soil surface, below the mulch. You won't have to waste water with overhead sprays having to get through the mulch first before they get to the plant roots. But I will say that once you've converted to drip, you may want to go out and spray your plants off once or twice during the summer to get the dust off, the collected pollen off of them, and just to kind of increase the local humidity that can really benefit plants in drip irrigated systems. But you really need to repair and adjust all of your systems every single year. You need to check them, you need to flush them, and you need to make sure that they're working properly. Irrigation is not a set it and walk away from it kind of a thing. You have to make sure that you're paying attention. And then you want to set your schedules so that you have zero runoff from your property. You can waste water with a drip system just like you can with sprays if you're not checking your schedules so that you irrigate in short pulses in order to maximize infiltration and eliminate the runoff. So I really want to encourage you to consult your local master gardeners for help on these issues. And if all else fails, hire a professional with the right certifications, either a QWell, Qualified Water Efficient Landscaper, or an Irrigation Association accreditation that shows that they've taken the proper training and that they know how to do these things, particularly in accordance with our current water efficient landscape ordinances in the state of California. So the next step, once you've optimized your system, you've got it running properly, is to make sure that the plants that you're planting are the right plant. So you want them to be matched to the soil. And we mentioned that a little bit earlier. It needs to be suited to your region, to your climate and your microclimate. It needs to be the right size for the space that you have it in, hydrozoned, and promotes biodiversity. So let's hit each of these quickly. If it's matched to your soil and you've done a simple test, you'll know whether or not that plant is going to be going into the ground in heavy clay soil or quickly draining sandy soil. These are key issues because some plants can tolerate damp and moist soil, and some need the water to be there briefly and drain quickly. You need to know whether you have a deep soil profile that can support large shrub and tree roots, or is it shallow? You've got 14, 16 inches and then a hard plant pan layer. That's going to affect whether or not you can effectively plant certain things. Now, sometimes these drainage issues might be alleviated if you've got a slope and you know that the water is going to infiltrate better, or a raised bed. And then the final thing to pay attention to is the pH of the soil. Is your soil acidic or alkaline, or is it neutral? There are particular plants, both in the California native palette and in palettes that we borrow from, that are intolerant of soil outside the neutral zone and won't be able to uptake nutrients and will suffer. So you need to pay attention to this and make sure you're checking your resources on those plants to know if they are matched to your soil type, and don't try to plant something that needs fast draining soil at the bottom of a hill where it's going to collect water. So important things to pay attention to. It needs to be appropriate to your region. So we have different, what we call climate zones, the USDA, which is typically what we call the cold hardiness zone. And it's really just based on the average low temperature. And then we have sunset zones. So in your area, your cold hardiness zone, depending on where you are, is going to be probably somewhere between 8B and 9B. But your sunset zone could be anything from 7 to 17. So you can get yourself a Sunset Western Garden book online pretty cheaply and find out what your sunset zone is. And this is a really informative thing because it incorporates more things like the heat tolerance and the sun exposure and whether or not that plant needs humidity, is tolerant to frost. So you want to check before buying or planting. And I guarantee you that almost every garden center you go into is going to have a Sunset Western Garden book behind the counter and of some edition or other. And they're going to be able to help you figure out whether or not the plants that you're looking at are suited to the region where you're living. Now, I want to make a quick note about using California natives because California is diverse and it's huge. So our soils can vary from clay to sand. Our rainfall can be anything from desert to rainforest. Our day length can be 8 degrees of latitude difference from the desert up to Northern California. And our heat and our cold, as you know, varies drastically. So just because something is a California native doesn't mean it's appropriate for where you are. You need to ask yourself, where in California is this plant native, and choose regionally appropriate species. Now, I want to give you some keys because there are 5 regions of the world that have a really similar climate. We call these the Mediterranean climate regions of the world. And so a lot of the plant palette that we use is borrowed from these other places like Southwestern Australia, Southwestern Africa, Central Chile, or the Mediterranean basin. So you want to look for things that have these water efficient leaf characteristics, which is going to include reduced leaf size like needles or needle-like leaves like you would see on a rosemary plant or a juniper. Light colored leaves, gray, silvery, hairy leaves. These all are reflective of light, and so they lose less water through transpiration in the high heat. Leaves that are held vertically. So this is a cool characteristic. You can see here on the left that these leaves that are on a bottle brush are held very similarly to the leaves of our native manzanita. So during the heat of the day, the leaf isn't laying flat horizontally where the hot sun hits it and causes a lot more evaporation. Additionally, succulent plants, which I think intuitively we all know are water efficient, or plants that have a waxy coating. So these are those stiff, crunchy leaves like with bay leaves or oak leaves, our native oak leaves. That thick, waxy cuticle keeps them from losing as much moisture. And then sort of intuitively, again, some are deciduous. So a lot of bulbs that come up, their leaves are in the spring, they've taken advantage of the winter rains, but then they die down and the flowers come up later. So these summer deciduous plants can also be very water efficient for us. So don't overlook those when you're looking for plants. But beyond that, let's talk about suited to the site or the microclimate, your specific site. So you need to look and pay attention to whether it's in the sun or in the shade. And if it's in the sun, is that morning sun or afternoon sun? Those are two very different things. Some plants that like shade will tolerate morning sun, but not afternoon sun. And if a plant label says it needs full sun, that means at least 6 hours of sun during the day. And if you don't, you're going to compromise things like blooming or leaf color, or the stems will grow extra long or extra thin, trying to capture more sun. And then you'll end up with leaves that are prone to wind tatter and pests like aphids that like thin succulent leaves. Look at where you're planting and see if it's on the windward or leeward side of a building or a windbreak or something that is going to cause brittle plants to break. This can be a key thing that causes plants to fail. And then sometimes you can cheat a little bit with plants that might be a little bit frost tolerant in your area. If, for instance, they're protected by the canopy of a tree or a large body of water that moderates the temperature. And again, maybe a south-facing wall that's going to absorb heat in the wintertime and radiate it back at night. So these are things that can sometimes mitigate those heat or frost factors. Now, I want you to get this one stuck in your brain, because this is the one people have the hardest time with, the mature size of the plant. And you're going to have to look on the label and maybe add 5%. Mature size fits the space. This reduces your need to prune it excessively in order to keep it into the space that you're planting it. Pruning excessively is not only detrimental to the plant, but it produces extra green waste that we're trying to avoid. So check all available resources. And I also want you to know that native plants can sulk a little bit after being planted, and it may take them 2 or 3 years to really get used to the place where you've put them in the ground. And they can also be slower growing, and it can take them longer to reach the full size. So be patient. Gardening is not an impatient person's pastime. You need to be patient and understand that gardens change and they grow, and that's okay. I just want to throw this out there, health strips. If you're planting in health strips, there's 2 things to keep in mind. You want to plant things that are either going to get tall enough so that you can see under them, or short enough that they aren't obscuring views for cars that are driving down the road or people who are trying to get out of a car in that area. Now, hydrozoning is when we group plants with similar water needs together, and this is really key both to plant health and to optimizing our water use. And there's a place you can go online that lists probably the majority of the plants that you're going to find in a nursery right now, the water use classification of landscape species, and this website is going to be available to you later on through a QR code. But there's some good print resources out there. The Sunset Western Garden Book is one okay resource, not always the most reliable for water use, but the Landscape Plants for California Gardens is an excellent one by Bob Perry, because he references plant water use and how it varies between the seasons. And then my colleagues later on are going to share with you some additional resources. Promoting biodiversity. I want to hit this one hard. When you're planting a garden, don't go for monoculture, 1 or 2 plants, 1 or 2 or 3 plants. To promote biodiversity and really give back what we have taken out by urbanizing our state, we want to make sure that we're providing for birds, bees, butterflies, lizards, all of the things that make for a great environment at your particular site. So you want to be thinking about providing pollen and nectar and seeds and shelter and water. So you want to select a variety of plant forms. You want to think about flowering throughout the season, from as early as you can, as late as you can. It is entirely possible in Northern California to have something flowering 12 months out of the year that provides for bees, as well as other beneficial insects. Consider having little saucers of water or recycling fountains that can provide both for the birds and for lizards low on the ground and for butterflies and other insects. Consider leaving dried seed heads on some of your plants like the asters and the rudbeckias and some of our other plants so that there are sources of seed for migrating birds. And then leave your tall grasses over the winter, your tall ornamental grasses. Don't cut them down too soon because they provide overwintering spots for a lot of our beneficial insects, particularly our ladybugs. This is also Bulbini, a South African plant, super low water use, provides pollen and nectar, and then provides an overwintering shelter in between those succulent, thin succulent leaves in the wintertime for bees in particular. Now, why did I say in the beginning that you should eliminate pesticides? The main reason is that most of what you're going to buy on the shelf in a store is going to be a broad spectrum chemical that kills beneficial insects along with the pests. Using them frequently can lead to resistance so that you create pests that are no longer affected by them. You can cause rebound infestations that are worse than before because now you've killed the beneficial insects that would have kept them in check, and they can end up in runoff. And so by eliminating them, what you do is you allow the natural population of predator and parasitoid insects to come in and bring those populations down. And you shouldn't expect to see zero pests in your garden. What you want is a tolerable level, and you're not going to get that unless you eliminate the pesticides and allow the natural predators to set up residence in your garden by using those other steps that we talked about as well. So resilience factors, smart plant selection is going to give you greater insect diversity in the garden, and that is going to give you built-in biological control of pests to a level that you can tolerate. So proper key here in proper planting is really key, and I want to hit this because everybody thinks they know how to stick a plant in the ground, but I want you to know that there are some key steps to making sure that it's successful. First of all, you need to look at the roots, pull the plant out of the pot, and make sure that there's no hard encircling roots. Now, if you're in the nursery, you can gently tease plants slightly out of their pot and make sure that they're not really pot bound and impossible to rehabilitate once you get home. You want a lot of healthy light colored roots. Those are the good healthy roots. And if you do get home and you've got some rotted roots in the bottom, trim those off. Just take an old bread knife or your hand shears and cut those off. It's okay to cut those plant roots because what you're going to do then is encourage branching and the development of new roots that are healthy. You've got these hard encircling roots, for instance, in a tree pot, you're going to end up with real problems because that tree will never develop a healthy structure and will eventually fall over. So how are we going to get this in the ground? If you don't first look at the roots, you won't know how big to dig your hole. So you need to examine them first and then make sure that you're not digging a hole any deeper than the healthy root ball, because you want that sitting on firm soil underneath it. This is not the way I was taught as a kid, but we know now that this is the best way for successful planting. So you can dig the hole 2 to 3 times as wide in order to loosen it up for the new roots that are going to be growing out, but don't dig too deep a hole. You want to break that soil up. You don't want to be putting big clods back in, and you only want to backfill with the same soil that you took out. So never put compost just in a hole. Don't do that. You end up creating too cushy an environment and the roots won't move out. And ultimately, after you've firmed the soil around it and watered it in, your plant should be a little bit above grade because all of that really highly organic potting soil that's in the pot you bought it in is going to decompose and that plant is going to drop down. And once it drops down, you don't want it below grade. You want it to be at or above grade once it's, after about a year. So you want to make sure that when you plant it, it's a bit above soil grade. And you can make a berm around it. A proper berm should look like this. It shouldn't be holding water right up next to the pot. And then in order to establish a really maximum capacity root system that makes that plant really adapted to drawing water from a really large soil volume, you want to gradually begin to water that further and further out. So you want to start right at that pot soil margin, but then gradually increase the width and depth that you're watering so that the roots will always have moist soil to grow into. And I want you to be aware, because before maturity, most plants are going to be a high water user until it's well established. And that may mean up to 3 years or 5 years if you're planting a really huge box tree, that you're going to have to make sure that you're keeping it well established until those roots grow out. Shrubs typically only need a year, and perennials that first hot growing season. So the key here is, again, know the plant. There are exceptions to this rule. So some plants like free monodendron, if you put one of those in the ground, you're going to water it in and you're going to leave it alone. It does not need that, but it's most of the plants that you put in will need some nursing along during the first summer. So the keys to really building garden resiliency from the ground up is to start by making sure that you've got a good, healthy soil, that you've broken up the compaction, added compost if necessary. You've optimized your water systems and your schedules to match what you're planting. You've selected your plants well. You know that they are hydrozoned together and that you've planted them properly and you've established them well. You want to reduce your pesticide use so that you can allow the natural populations of biodiversity to move in and create your own pest management system, as well as just providing for all of those wonderful creatures that we have in our environment. And then establishing them well the first year is going to give you a really good start to building garden resiliency.
Thank you so very much, Carrie. And now we're going to go to Saxon. Thank you. Can you stop your, okay, here's Saxon Holt, who will be sharing his screen.
Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. I'm just delighted to be here, and I am just really glad to have heard what Carrie had to say. And Carrie, that was just fantastic. I hope all of you record that or get back to it. It's a clinic on establishing a resilient garden and what they mean in our area. I will make a case that we are in a summer dry area. That's a term I like better than Mediterranean, but I love what Carrie said. It's a lush landscape, a low water landscape. In fact, in my new book, that's a subtitle. I'm here in North Marin, part of the Sonoma regional watershed, I guess, as far as providing water. This is Mount Burdell State Park, which is literally across the street from me. It's a landscape that I love. I think it's important that we all learn to love our own landscapes, that it's really part of how we learn to garden. It's a mission statement for me, and our whole Summer Dry project is now in the midst of this tumultuous climate change. We realize it's all the more important that gardeners be stewards of the land and attuned to the local environment on behalf of all creatures. Every act we do adds resiliency. The beauty of a garden is not just the aesthetic beauty of what we think it is. It's really important to understand all the creatures. I'm here really to help people understand how to use plants. Carrie touched on it. My presentation will be mostly about plants, how to use them, where they come from, and how to anticipate what they're going to do in gardens. This is my new book, Gardening in Summer Dry Climates. So happens the subtitle is Plants for a Lush, Water-Conscious Landscape. I'm so delighted that Carrie liked that low water lush concept, and it's really it's quite possible if you choose the right plants to have a garden that looks lush, even though they're adapted to the climate. Part of our overall project for the Summer Dry is not just the book. We have a website, the Summer Dry website, where we have a newsletter and monthly news and databases and plant articles. There is an Instagram account, which is really fun because it's people all over the world in other summer dry climates. And also the WUCL's connection. That's really part of our work with the Summer Dry project. Carrie mentioned it, but it's a state database. We are adding plants and photos for the low and very low water plants in that database to help gardeners understand what plants really look like. Otherwise, the database is really just a water calculation system, but it has great potential, and we're working on updating it. Literally, that's my work these days. So I would remind everyone that why we garden. It is for beauty. Carrie mentioned all the various aspects, and fundamentally, we do want them to work for ourselves. But as Doug Tallamy says, it's tempting to garden for beauty without regarding the many ecological roles our landscapes must perform. His new book is Nature's Best Hope, and Nature's Best Hope is a garden. And that's really part of why we're all here. I think hopefully why we want to garden and what we will see in our gardens. I'm going to digress a little bit because this picture, this garden, is the cover of the book. I'll go back. Maybe here you can see on the far left that Charlotte Torigowski's garden here in North Marin. It's the garden I know well. Charlotte is many of you may know, is a deep advocate for climate adapted plants, a lot of native plants, as a master propagator herself. For those of you who can't make the tour, I'm going to show a few pictures of her garden right now. It's a remarkable garden. It's right near me. I literally can walk to her garden. It's climate adapted and deer adapted. It's totally open. This is her front yard by the road. With arbutus madrone arbutus, various grasses and salvias. It's just totally accessible to deer. But the combination of plants are not just native. You use different plants for structure and texture. And it's really an inspiration for me, and it's part of why I really do my work. I love plants. I love gardens. And I love to find combinations of plants that work well together. Here's a native part of her garden with a native salvia called Guglandii, and of course the poppies. But other parts of her garden use plants from other parts of the world. I'll be using the term summer dry climates as opposed to Mediterranean, because I think Mediterranean is selling the concept a little bit short, and I'm going to have some maps in a minute to talk about that. But it's important that we don't garden just for our own beauty. We need to think about why we are even here on this planet and the rest of the creatures that we must live with. Here, there's again, still in Charlotte's garden, the milkweed, the native milk, Asclepias fasciculatus. It's great for monarchs. It's beautiful. It can be part of our own aesthetic as well as the aesthetic for nature. I want to talk a little bit about these other climate zones of the world. The Köppen-Geiger climate classification maps comes from 150 years ago, when a German botanist, Vladimir Köppen, came up with some vegetation maps of the world. I think there are clear correlations to different parts of the world. What we are really interested in particular, are the ones that are adapted to summer dry. There are 5 other regions of the world. He has them broken down by CSA, CSB, and CSC, where C is just a mild temperate type climate. The second letter, S, is for dry summers. There are many dry summers. And then the third one are different types of dry summers, whether they're hot or cold, but they all have a lot of things in common. And these are commonly called Mediterranean zones, but I would argue that it's broader than that. I love this map from the Pacific Bulb Society. For those of you who are, it's a great resource for folks in summer dry climates. This shows, if we back up, those 5 regions that we typically call Mediterranean are really broader than that, especially when we actually look over the Mediterranean. The summer dry regions go into Western Asia, into the steppes. The Bulb Society has made good note of that because they love bulbs and collect bulbs. And a lot of bulbs that we love and go dormant in the summer here originate for these parts of the world. You'll also notice that in the West Coast, it's not just California that's summer dry. Much of the Pacific coast is summer dry. It's hard to call Portland and Seattle Mediterranean climates, but they're clearly summer dry. They offer some of the same challenges that we have in California. And also, it's interesting, I have had conversations with friends in San Diego who are challenging my concept that this is called summer dry because they're getting monsoons. And we had those monsoons weather here last year with those fires and the lightning. The weather is changing. So if we get summer water, it's no longer summer dry, and it's also hard to call that even a Mediterranean climate. But these are really vegetation zones. And I like to think of them as ecotopes. And gardeners that share the common ecotopes can often share plants that are adapted and climate tolerant and sustainable. These were the criteria for selecting plants for the new book, which is really a resource. It's an encyclopedia mostly. And it's the core, it's an exploration of plants from these summer dry ecotopes and the 5 regions that are adapted to each other. We certainly need to have discussion of habitat, about native plants, how plants from these other regions might or might not be invasive, and their ecosystem services. But that's the art of gardening, really, and why gardeners need resources to help find those adapted plants. It's no surprise that gardeners tend to love plants, and we just want to make sure we pick the right ones that are adapted to our own local climates, which leads me to the term, the ecotone. An ecotone is from the Greek word, and showing ecosystems in tension, and that's really what a garden is. This is for those of you who can't make the garden tour, this is a small garden in Mill Valley that's on the tour. I use this for the ecotone section because we see here the oak woodlands of Northern California, and here is the oak. This garden was designed around this particular oak tree. The Allison Bloom opened it up and allowed the oak tree to dominate, but they created like an ecotone of other plants that are adapted to it. As you enter the garden, you come through a hedge of a native California evergreen, the myrtle, and you come into the garden, and you turn around, you look back out and you see this wonderful Fremontodendron, which, as Carrie said, needs absolutely no water. I know personally, when I lived in Sonoma, I killed 2 of them by watering them. I thought I was doing them a favor, and they rotted. But going into the garden, looking back, you can see the myrtle hedge on the left and the other native shrub, the Fremontodendron. But it's not just native plants, which is what's so fun for me as a gardener, is finding other plants that are not native necessarily to California, that still are adapted or low water, perform various ecosystem services. So when we did the book was picked up off the original East Bay Mud book, which was only for the gardeners in the Bay Area, but we felt we wanted to have a service to the larger summer dry climates and the various ecotones across the whole Pacific coast. For sake of organization, we divided it up into 4 sections: Southern California, Northern California, Interior Valley, and the Northwest. And we urge any of you to understand that that's where our own, we learn to garden from what's native in our own areas. From Southern California, we use a coastal chaparral example. This is Torrey Pines Park, where it's in bloom. It's lush, it's beautiful, and it's obviously quite adapted to the climate. For inland valleys, we chose, this is Carrizo Plains, with showing all the various valleys and heat. The valleys are really hot. They're really totally different from the coastal regions, and the plants that are adapted to it are different as well. The same photo I like here of Northern California, Mount Burdell, with in this case, the flowering buckeye tree in it, but mostly an oak woodland. For the Pacific Northwest, we use this state park outside of Portland, Camasia State Park, which shows in the spring with the native oaks and the wildflowers in flower. So I really want to think about Obi Kaufman. He's a sort of a hero of mine. I hope a lot of you know his work. It's really important to, I think, for all of us to understand how we fit in to the world of environmentalism. I want to read this. I can't read my screen right this minute because it's my face is on it. But Obi says, my work operates in what can be called a post-environmentalist world, where the arguments of pure logic are over, and we've moved on from merely toiling to prevent degradation to now greater visions wrapped up in better stories of how we mitigate catastrophe. Two opposing truths are relevant. One, the amount of biodiversity still extant is a miracle. And two, we are already in the bottleneck of cascading effects toward a permanently altered biosphere. In my own daily practice of making sprawling books of California nature, I aim to balance the discourse of this big picture stuff, all the while concentrating on the smallest geographically specific niche truths upon which the living world relies. I just love that he finishes that, these geographically specific niche truths. That's what gardens are. That's what these ecosystems that we get inspired for are. They're geographically specific. And if we want to garden in them, we need to adapt to the native habitats. So I've chosen 4 photos that are adapted to each of these 4 ecosystems. We'll start here, Southern California. This is a Carex lawn over, which doesn't exactly mimic the chaparral, but it's still an open, scrubby oaks overlooking the oceans. For the inland valleys, I really love this garden in Santa Maria with this wonderful rock wall leading the eye out toward the valley and the mountains and beyond. In Northern California, this is just a garden that I actually wanted to be the cover of the book. I really like the mature arbutus in it, Arbutus marina, and the mature phormiums and the mature grass meadow. Carrie mentioned it's really important when we pick our garden plants to understand how big they get. Anyone who got wrapped up in the phormium craze 15, 20 years ago when they were first introduced now realizes how big they get. Anyone who wants to plant an agave americana from a little plant, you get a plant sale, realizes they get big. So I really like showing mature gardens for all of my work to give gardeners an understanding of what success looks like, what a garden has been sustained, and what it looks like at a climax. So you have an idea of how beautiful it really can be. For the Pacific Northwest, we use this demonstration garden in Seattle. A lot of the plants there get absolutely no water. They're plants, but still we can imagine here with grasses, onions, berberis, various native shrubs, all are adapted. And when chosen wisely, they're just fantastically beautiful. Most of my presentation really is going to be about plants, and it's really how I look at things. I like to go see what success looks about, but we did touch on some other very broad garden design concepts in the book. We have one of my favorite things we need to talk about are the bioswales and infrastructure adaptations and how we collect water, how we use it, how we keep it from running down storm drains, and maximize it for our own gardens. I like to say our climate, if summer dry, is not drought. It's supposed to be dry in the summer. Our problem is when it's dry in the winter. So if we have bioswales such as this one at UC Davis, where water runs off the parking lot, it can filter into the ground before it ever gets to the storm drains, or in this case, where it would have gone to Puda Creek. I'm going to show a few other ideas of water adaptation. I don't want to spend too much time on them because I know we will have a lot of questions later, but I think it's important for us to understand cisterns. These are cisterns in a backyard in Walnut Creek. Judy Adler, the environmentalist, who some of you may know, these are her cisterns. The water comes off the roof, and since the roof is higher than the cisterns, it fills them up. I also advocate for people when they collect water from rain in the winter, they used to use it in the winter. It's when the plants need it. Don't save the water for the summer, especially these. Of course, now there's not much water to spare, but when you do collect water in the winter, because we're the nature of our storms that we're getting infrequent but bigger storms, maybe weeks apart. If you collect the water in the winter, either in rain barrels or even small cisterns, you can release it in the winter, a week or two after the rain. That's when the plants want it. That's when you want to get it deeper into the water table. This is a little garden in Southern California. I composed this to show the roof so that you can understand when it does rain, the water goes down through the gutter and then percolates through the front yard through a clever design with some rock mulches and good plant selections. Sometimes we think of these as rain gardens, but the overall concept is to collect the water that does come from rain and put it back in the ground. In our cities, we've paved them over with subdivisions and concrete and roads. Water that we do get often doesn't go into the ground table. And so it's important to modify our own concept of how we garden so that water does percolate and run through our yards. I show this as an example. Carrie did a great job of talking about irrigation and concepts of irrigation. I show this because our book is called Summer Dry Gardens, but it doesn't mean no water in summer. We need water to get the plants started. We need them for various hydration to get them started. We need to use water very efficiently. And that's really part of my work, is to help people understand which garden plants can be water efficient. Mimi's going to talk a lot more about firescaping in her presentation. In our book, we talked briefly about firescaping and how to use trees that are limbed back away from the house, low growing plants, hardscape by the house, and succulents are really useful. If you really want to have lawns are too water sucking, but Carex lawns take much less water, but can still offer some of the buffer for firescaping that some people really need. Show this one picture in the book is to represent carbon sequestration. Carrie mentioned in her presentation about the need for healthy soils and the environmental advantages of healthy gardens. Carbon sequestration is a really big concept, but just so people understand, having plants capture carbon from the atmosphere and put it back in the ground with healthy soil is what makes it all work. And then most of the book is really about plants. And I'm going to go through a various selection of why we chose various things. This is a California native coffee berry. It's in a very tiny garden front yard in Oakland. I chose it to show how it can be pruned for an ornamental effect, but also pruned up to allow some sunlight to get underneath it. In this case, so the gardeners can have some native wildflowers. I really love this native quail bush, Atriplex lentiformis. It's in a garden in Southern California, but chosen because it has silver foliage, and as well as the ecosystem services. It's also called quail bush. Quails obviously love to nest underneath it, but its silver foliage looks so fantastic here with the ceanothus flowering. I love daffodils. Obviously, they're not native, but they're so perfectly adapted to our climate that I use them. I have hundreds and hundreds of them in my own garden. There's a lot of the photos I'm showing from here on out are gardens in Sonoma and Marin, gardens that I've seen in my work. Here's a lovely garden in Marin. I love the fact they've used this yucca rostrata with bougainvillea, with an oak tree, madrones, palms, all sorts of different plants that are adapted to summer dry climates, but giving great architectural interest, beauty, and just fun. You know, most gardeners really just love plants. It's just fun to imagine what plants we can use and how we can put them together here with shrubs and grasses and succulents and trees. It's just these combinations are all adapted to our own summer dry climate without the use of a lot of water. And again, my work with this book and the Summer Dry Project is to help people know which plants are adapted and understanding your own little microclimates. Mixing non-natives with natives. The woolly sunflower, the California native, mixed in with lavender and a salvia called hot lips. Just a wonderful combination of plants. I'll mention this later too. This is a new garden. This is Charlotte Torigowski has started a garden, growing grounds, habitat gardens in Nevada to be a source for plants. I think it's going to be on the tour next year, but I've visited a couple times. I know Charlotte is going to be quite a lovely showcase of plants. But when we choose plants, we need these references like books and websites to understand which plants are adapted. This is our local California native Fremantodendron, but it's a low growing one. I think it's called Ken Taylor. It's prostrate, it grows over rocks and boulders and stays small. Fremantodendron can get really big in gardens. It's native to Marin and Sonoma. It gets really big in the wild. It can be, somewhat ragged looking, but chosen wisely, these natives can be really adapted to them. This is one of my favorite slides because it talks about the concept of native plants. This is at the UC Davis Teaching Arboretum. This is a ceanothus called Valley Violet. And it's important that we understand our native plants originate in their own specific ecotones and climates. Not all native plants are adapted to all other climates. It's sort of obvious when we say redwood trees are adapted to the coast, but they're not adapted to inland. But then we think about Joshua trees. People think of those as drought tolerant, but they're not drought tolerant in Death Valley. It's just a matter of choosing the right plant for your own area. With ceanothus and Octostaths, salvias, many California native plants, when you find them in the nursery, they have come from one specific place. They may not be adapted to your garden. So this Valley Violet ceanothus is adapted to Davis, to Central Valley. It does great in really hot summers. But some ceanothus that might have come from coastal regions might not be so well adapted. Octostaths, which is one of my favorite plants because they're so architectural. As they get older, the foliage dies back, the younger branches die back, but then you can prune them up and they're lovely. The whole architectural look of them in a garden is really spectacular. This is the same garden, the series here, the same gardens in Sonoma County. We call them Melissa Garden. I don't think it's still around. But it's the same shot of those Octostaths looking back toward them, toward the house. Around the pool, the garden was designed by Kate Fry. Some of you, I'm sure, remember Kate when she lived in the area, using all native plants around the edge of the pool. And then incorporating water into the garden. Carrie mentioned that in her presentation, but it's a great function for wildlife of any kind, birds, butterflies, insects. We need to have some kind of water in our gardens just for the whole cooling aspect of it. I think having a water feature in a hot summer garden just makes you cooler just to look at it. And again, just covering, having plants cover the soil. These are all adapted plants. Even on the far left, we see that rose, that's Rosa mutabilis, which is really a deep-rooted, really tough rose. I've seen it in a lot of old gardens. It survives really well. But we can have that lush look if we choose our plants wisely and give them just the right amount of water when they do need it. I want to close really, we start talking about some of the resources we do have for gardens. I like to look at gardens. I like to go photograph them and see what success is. I certainly like the research and reading about things, but until we see them, we don't know. It's really why these garden tours that the Water District is promoting are so important, to go see what other people are actually using. The Teaching Arboretum at UC Davis is fantastic. This is the Storer Garden, S-T-O-R-E-R. For generations, they've been studying plants, trying different roses, which ones do survive with only once or twice a month water. It's a great resource. We're really lucky in Sonoma and Marin to have some really good local nurseries. Cal Flora and Fuller up near Santa Rosa is a fantastic source for native plants. There's Emerisa nursery in Sebastopol. There's any number of small independent nurseries that know which plants are adapted to our climate. This is a picture from the new Habitat Growing Ground nursery that Charlotte is starting that I think will be on the tour next year. These are plants that she knows and is cultivating. But when we want to choose our plants, don't go to the big box stores. I mean, maybe you get lucky at the big box stores, or if you're shopping just for vegetables or maybe your annual plants, your pansies or petunias or something, that's fine. But to design a garden that's adapted, that's going to be resilient and be sustained, get plants that are pre-adapted. The nurseries know that. There are increasingly more native plants that are available in the nurseries, as well as the ones from other summer dry climates. And remember, when you choose those plants, it feels really good to do it for the whole garden earth. That idea of beauty that's not just about what we think is beautiful is so comforting to know that we can contribute to the ecological health of the planet. It's what we all really must do. We really are in a crisis, but we do not need to be depressed about it. It's something we can actually do. So I remind you, there's a new book out, which is, I say, mostly a plant book. The Instagram account, we have a website, and do use the WUCL's database. I'm looking forward to having some questions later on, but remind people that we are in the midst of tumultuous climate change. It's more important that we be stewards of the land, attuned to the local environment on behalf of all creatures. Every act we do adds resiliency. Every part of our gardens are important. So I'm going to, I think, quit here. I'm going to stop my share, turn it back over to Mimi, I think is next.
Thank you, Saxon. That was amazing. And now it's my opportunity to try to bring to those incredible foundations of content that both Carrie and Saxon shared with us, bring a lens of fire landscaping to that content. And I'm hoping that many of you are already familiar with the UC Master Gardener program and what we do. We're trained agents at the University of California, and our mission is to extend the educational outreach of UC to our community. And we do that with a focus on science-based information with sustainable landscape principles as our core foundation. So I have to say that after the 2017 wildfires, as a program, we spent a year doing a deep dive into all the content that's out there on defensible space. And our goal was really to synthesize and simplify the content for our community, and to really look at marrying those sustainable landscape principles that that both Carrie and Saxon have shared with us, to marry those principles with Firewise landscaping, because in some cases there are tensions between those two. And I noted that we were already getting a lot of questions in the Q&A during Carrie and especially Carrie's presentation around questions like mulch and leaf litter. And hopefully the content I'm going to be sharing with you will help you translate that and give you information for how to incorporate keeping those really important sustainable landscape principles, but also being prepared for future fires, which certainly we here in Sonoma County are very clear that we need to be better prepared for. So I wanted to highlight that what I'm sharing today is really not meant as prescriptive mandates, but more as guidelines for each individual for making their own personal decision-making on their property. We do know that each of us needs to make these decisions to be better prepared as we move ahead, though. Okay, so today I'm focusing on the 0 to 100 foot perimeter surrounding your home or structures, classically known as the defensible space zone. And I'm going to start by taking you through some really basic principles, touch briefly on plant selection considerations. Both Carrie and Saxon did a really great job laying that foundation. And then step you through recommendations in the 3 defensible space zones, along with some photos for design inspiration. But I have to say, after seeing Saxon's presentation, I'm going to have to ask him if we can have a number of those to incorporate into our presentation moving forward in the future. Okay, so here are some foundational Firewise landscaping principles. And as Carrie so really aptly said, resilient gardens are about appropriate plant selection. And then Firewise gardens are very importantly focused on plant placement, overall garden design with hardscape elements incorporated in, and access for ease of maintenance. So as I said earlier, each landscape is unique and must be considered individually. For example, I live in northeastern Sonoma County, northeast of Cloverdale, in northern Sonoma County. And I live in a very high fire severity zone. And I abut directly up against wildland in an area where fire is likely to come. So what I'm doing to prepare my landscape is maximizing these design and maintenance principles that I'm going to be sharing with you. But each of us should be making our own personal decisions about what we need to do given our own individual and unique landscape. But you should also make sure you understand what is required by law and where the research is being done. Use science to inform your decisions. So it's important to note that there isn't scientific research to support all of the recommendations that I'm going to be sharing in my presentation, but I will point out through the presentation where recommendations are supported by scientific research. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on fire and how it operates, but I want to cover a few basics which are important to the context of what I'm going to be sharing with you today. So fire must have three elements in order to burn, and that is fuel, oxygen, and heat. And very basically, a fuel is anything that will burn. So that can include vegetation in our landscapes, mulch, fencing, lawn furniture, arbors, a planter box, a quar doormat that might be in front of our house. I've even seen videos of brooms that were left against a house being burned. So we need to think about that in a fire, the only element that we have control over is the fuel. And that's why it's so important for us to do our preparedness as much as we can in advance of future events. So there are three types of threats or types of fire exposure that a building can experience during a wildfire. I think most classically, people think of direct flame content, but there's also radiant heat that can be heat generated by nearby burning, in this case, a tool shed. But the most prevalent factor that we need to be thinking about in our preparedness efforts are embers, windborne embers. And certainly we have a lot of very painful direct experience with that here in Sonoma County. So the majority of structure ignitions are associated with embers. So they can ignite building components and contents directly, or they can ignite vegetation and other combustible items adjacent to or near a building. And this can then result in a radiant heat and or direct flame contact exposure. So embers have a way of finding a weakness in a home. And since most building ignitions are attributed to embers, this is really an important aspect for us to be aware of as we work to prepare our homes against future fires. For example, embers may land on and ignite debris that has accumulated in your gutter. And that burning debris then causes a direct flame content on the edge of the roof. Or embers can ignite nearby vegetation, which could result in one of those radiant heat exposures to the side of the building, which could ignite combustible siding or break a window. And from that broken glass, then embers would be allowed to enter the building and ignite combustible materials in the interior, such as carpeting or furniture. Okay, so these are some really key basic things to do in your landscape to make it more firewise. You want to remove all dead or dying plants and branches and remove ladder fuels. And I'm going to touch on that in a bit more in a few more minutes. The recommendation is to create islands of plantings with non-combustible paths between them to interrupt the path of the fire. And I'll discuss that in some more length further on in the presentation as well. You want to avoid planting or mulching close to all structures. And then you need to prune tree limbs up at least 6 feet or 1/3 of the tree height from the ground or from understory plants. Okay, so we've already gotten some questions in the Q&A. Excuse me. And I know some of you may have come to today's session hoping for a list of fire-resistant plants for your garden. In the scientific community, there is a lack of consensus on the elements to test to confirm a plant's flammability. So given this, the University of California does not advocate the use of fire-resistant plant lists. Lists, in fact, can encourage complacency, i.e., I've picked all these plants from a fire-resistant plant list, I'm done, I don't have to do anything else. Or they can be misleading, and applied to all plants, the term fire-resistant is very misleading, as all plants will burn under the right conditions. On hot, windy days when the ground is dry and plants have little moisture in stems and leaves, fire can race through almost any landscape, threatening homes and lives. So if there's any defense against fire in landscaping, it is more likely through Firewise landscape design and maintenance rather than plant selection. And proper maintenance is key to fire resistance. So it's particularly important to keep dead leaves and branches from building up in the center of a plant, which will then make that much more flammable. So I'm hoping to give you a different lens through what I'm going to share with you in the presentation today. That gives you a lens to walk through your own landscape and look for what might create a receptive fuel bed that would ignite, for example, if embers landed there. Okay, so I don't need to spend too much time on this topic because Carrie did such a brilliant job on this, as did Saxon actually. But there are a number of things you need to consider in plant selection from a Firewise perspective. Saxon did a great job talking about plant selection should no longer be about, oh, this flower is pretty. And trust me, I have fallen victim to that many of times myself personally. But there are much broader considerations from a fire and ecology perspective that we should be taking into account. Carrie did a great job talking about proper planting techniques. We know that a poorly planted plant is stressed and will require more water, nutrients, and will therefore be more susceptible to predation, drought, and fire. So right plant put in the right place is very important in Firewise landscaping. So you want to choose a plant that is going to grow to a size appropriate for its location. So when you pick up that little 4-inch pot with a plant at the nursery, you need to pay real attention to its mature size and where you are planning to put it in your landscape. So you want to, and again, Carrie did a great job talking to this, you want to locate plants where excess pruning is not required to maintain desired spacing. And Carrie also did a great job talking about, is it going to thrive where you're planting it? But another key important aspect is to consider, is it going to require more maintenance than you're going to be willing to provide now or in the future? And that can significantly affect the fuel load that you're generating on your property. It's important, of course, to consider whether the plant's invasive and whether it might spread to a neighbor's property and create a fire threat, which would affect fuel load over wider areas. And you need to consider how a plant changes over its lifespan, which can also affect the fuel load. For example, lavender is a great example. It starts out as very herbaceous and becomes more woody over time, which will make it more flammable. So after being deeply enmeshed in this topic, I really have started to begin seeing landscapes through a different lens. It was almost impossible for me to watch Saxon's presentation and not assess, what I thought was, how Firewise it was or was not. And I was very, very happy to see that many of them were very Firewise. But I do think now about how fire will move through that landscape, especially around my own home, and how much fuel that might add to a fire and how much woody mass is there. So for example, with that lens last winter, I cut back some larger salvias that had become really, really woody. And they've grown back really beautifully this spring with more herbaceous stems with less woody mass. So they will become woody again in a year or two, and I'll have to cut them back again. But it's important to know when you're selecting your plants, if you don't want to do that kind of ongoing maintenance, then you really need to be selecting plants that aren't going to require that over time. Hopefully you're all familiar with the concept of ladder fuels. The goal is to reduce the possibility of having a fire move from the ground plane up into the canopy of the trees. So it's critical to avoid planting shrubs underneath trees. If you do, you need to allow at least 3 times the height of that shrub between it and the lowest tree limb. And again, I feel like I beat this like a dead horse. You need to limb up all your trees 6 feet from the ground or 1/3 from the height of the tree. And then again, it's critical to continue to maintain that as it grows. Okay, so these are CAL FIRE recommendations for plant spacing guidelines within the 100 feet defensible space zone around your home and structures. And I want to make sure that I point out that these are, number one, not mandated by law, and these are not based on scientific research. These are really just the best practice recommendations from CAL FIRE, from their experiences, to make to individuals as they're looking to better prepare their home against future fires. So these guidelines for horizontal and vertical spacing are due to flame height and can be significantly impacted by the slope of the land around the home, which is a really major consideration and factor in assessing wildfire risk. So I'm sure many of you already know that a fire will burn faster and more intensely uphill than along flat ground. So a steeper slope is going to result in a faster moving fire with taller flame lengths. So spacing between grasses, shrubs, and trees is crucial to reduce the spread of wildfires. And then that spacing needs to be greater based on the slope of the land. So on a flat or gently sloping terrain, individual shrubs or small clumps of shrubs should be separated from one another by at least twice the height of the average shrub. So for example, on a slope of less than 20%, if the typical shrub height of a plant grouping is 2 feet, then you want to create a separation between those shrub plantings of at least 4 feet by removing shrubs or pruning to reduce their height and or diameter. And then of course, for homes located on steeper slopes, that separation distance should be greater. So this graphic is depicting shrub spacing. In our discussions with firefighting personnel, they have advised that low growing, well irrigated grasses or ground covers or perennials would be acceptable between these plant groupings. But again, each of us needs to assess the overall risk of our own properties with the degree of slope and fire risk to make appropriate decisions in our own home landscapes. So this graphic is depicting suggested horizontal tree spacing, again, as well that vertical separation concept, that ladder fuels concept we discussed earlier. So note again that on the right side of these graphics, it's showing that 3 times the height of a shrub, the top of a shrub, to the lowest tree branches, if you're going to have any shrubs below your trees. Now for spacing on a less than 20% slope, it's recommended to have 10 feet between your trees. And then on steeper slopes, of course, that recommended distance is increased. So it's important to know that we don't have to denude our landscapes in the 100-foot perimeter around the home. But we do want to make sure we have spacing to reduce the fuel volume and help break up the flow of fire to the house. Okay. So the starting point of any of your work to prepare your home against, reduce the risk for your structures against the threat of future fires is you want to start at your house and then work out from there into the landscape. So I'm not going to be going into the topic of home hardening today, as our focus is on the landscape, but there are many wonderful resources to help guide you through the home hardening process. But here are the different defensible space zones in your home landscape that I'm going to be discussing with you today. So once you've hardened your home, after you've done the work to harden your home, you then want to move out to the 0 to 5 foot perimeter around your structures, then to the 5 to 30 foot zone, and then to the 30 to 100 foot zone. Okay, so let's start off with, we've hardened our home. Let's start off with the 0 to 5 foot zone from around your structures, your perimeter around your structures, which is called the Ember defense zone. So this is a relatively newer zone introduced into defensible space recommendations. In fact, even 2 years ago, when we were working on presentation and content development to help do outreach to our community, we had a really hard time finding graphics that depicted the 0 to 5 foot zone. So that's how new this zone is. I do want to stress that this zone is supported by scientific research. And I talked earlier about how the majority of home ignitions are due to embers. So the objective of this zone is to reduce the chance of wind-blown embers from a fire landing near the home and igniting combustible debris or materials, thus exposing the home to flames. So since this zone is closest to the house, it requires our most careful selection and management of vegetation and other possible fuels. So classically, we've massed shrubs against the house, called foundation shrubs. So this is really a big shift away from how we have traditionally designed our landscapes. But we really need to think about the fuel that is in that immediate proximity to our house and the type of risk that that brings. So the recommendation is to minimize planting here. Optimally, you will have no combustible materials in this zone. So that means no mulch, and that also means no plant materials. But that's a very difficult shift for people to make. Minimally, you need to remove any planting that is under vents and eaves, in front of windows or combustible siding, and under or near a deck, because those are the most highest vulnerability factor in introducing fire into your home. If, for example, you have a dense woody shrub in front of a window, it has a lot of dead debris or leaf matter that's been accumulated in the interior of it over years from pruning it to keep its size reduced. That makes a very receptive fuel bed for embers, which would then ignite the shrub, break the glass of the window from the heat of the fire, and then introduce the fire into your home. So it's also incredibly important to regularly remove dead or dry plant material. And it is a county code requirement in Sonoma to prune all tree limbs within 10 feet of a chimney or a stovepipe. So we're not saying that if you have an existing mature oak tree, for example, planted close to your home, we're not saying that you need to remove that tree. But what you do need to pay attention to is what maintenance that's going to introduce. Is it dropping leaf debris on your roof that you're going to have to be regularly cleaning up during fire season? Is it dropping leaf debris in that 0 to 5 foot zone that you're also going to have to be regularly cleaning up? For example, there is a large mature oak tree within probably, I'd say, about 10 feet of the home that I live in. And on every red flag day, I am walking around the perimeter of my home, and I am blowing any oak leaf debris that's accumulated on the brick pathway around the perimeter of my house. I'm moving any furniture away from the structure. So, so we can coexist with things that exist that might contribute to a higher fire risk, say with this leaf debris that's being dropped in my 0 to 5 foot zone at my home. But you need to be kicking into high gear from a preparedness perspective when we're on higher risk days like red flag warning days. So there's a really compelling video from the Kincaid fire in 2019 in Sonoma County, where firefighters are trying to hold off the fire from moving into the town of Windsor. And the video clip shows wood fences burning and moving the fire to the house via wood gates directly attached to the house. So it's very important to replace any wood fence or gate that attaches to your home. And I've got a couple pictures here of some good alternatives in non-organic materials that can help still provide you with some screening or protection. On the lower left is a wrought iron fence and a gate attached to a home. And on the upper right, that's actually a fence and a gate made out of hardy board, which is a product made of cement, sand, and cellulose fibers. And note that the rear fence on the upper right picture is actually made of wood products. The key here is to not use wood gate in attachment directly to a structure. And in fact, these are both properties that burned during the 2017 fires complex here in Sonoma County and have been rebuilt. Okay, so as I talked about before, a lot of people really struggle with the idea of removing all the plant materials within 5 feet of their home. Because that concept of foundation shrubs directly against the house has really become deeply ingrained. So I just wanted to share a few pictures to try to help you visualize what a Firewise 0 to 5 foot zone can look like. And there are lots of creative ways to use hardscape in this zone that will prevent embers from igniting organic material and then transmitting fire to your home. These are also homes that burned in the 2017 fires complex here in Sonoma County that have been rebuilt. You can see nice gravel perimeters. The one on the upper right probably be with being a little wider. It's not that full 5 feet. And then on the left-hand picture, I shared this picture in a presentation a few months ago, and a firefighter said, well, I sure hope that the homeowner is going to move those 2 wicker chairs on a red flag warning day. So again, we need to keep in mind the preparedness on red flag warning days. So just a few more ideas, stepping stone pathways with rocks against the house in that 0 to 5 foot zone, and a gravel pathway on the left. And Saxon had a beautiful picture of low water use native lawn option. If you need to keep a lawn, if you have kids that are using it to play, that's about one of the only reasons I can think of for keeping a lawn, frankly, in summer dry California, because it is one of the highest uses of water. There are some great native lawn alternatives. This is showing a Nomo Fescue. This is from a house that survived the 2017 fires, but the landscape and the entire perimeter burned. And this is irrigated. It can be mowed, even though it can be left in its natural state. I think the picture that Saxon showed it in its natural unmowed state, but that would be a safe use within the 0 to 5, and in this case, we're moving into the 5 to 30 foot zone. Okay, so let's move onto the 5 to 30 foot zone, which is called the home defense zone. So this is likely where firefighters will make a stand if they're working to defend your home from a wildfire. So it's really important to keep this in mind to ensure that they have ease of access. So the recommendation is to plant in islands, and that you separate your islands of planting by non-combustible pathways to help interrupt the flow of fire towards your home. Optimally, you want to be using smaller shrubs and ground covers to a maximum height of 3 feet. And herbaceous perennials and succulents are great options in the 5 to 30 foot zone. Trees are okay if they're green and free of dead plant material, you've removed any ladder fuels, and you're regularly maintaining them. And again, you really want to make sure that you're making sure that all your plants, you have ease of access for maintaining them. So the 5 to 30 foot zone is a really great place to maximize your hardscape. It's in closest proximity to your home, and that really will help reduce possible fuels moving in to ignite your home. So again, from a design perspective, you want to focus on low growing, optimally mostly perennial plants that are well maintained and hydrated. Appropriately selected native plants. We know if you choose low water use native plants, they need less water to keep them hydrated and healthy and thriving in your landscape. You can see in this picture here on the right that there's a pathway on the left, and then the road and sidewalks are helping create those hardscape aspects and elements between the planting. So here's another a rebuild post 2017 fire in the Mark West area of Sonoma County with a really nice example of some mostly herbaceous plants under 3 feet with a specimen tree. And those planting areas are separated by a gravel path below, and then a stone patio up top. Okay, so now we'll move out to the 30 to 100 foot zone from the structure, called the reduced fuel zone. And we have the same basic principles in the 30 to 100 foot zone as we do in the 5 to 30 foot zone. But you can include shrubs and trees in widely spaced groups. So you want to continue the focus on creating islands of vegetation that are separated by hardscape and ensure that you have easy access for maintenance. Wider pathways can help facilitate that access. Continue your ongoing and regular vigilance on removing dead plant material and ladder fuel, any possible ladder fuels. And use of wood mulch and leaf litter is okay in this zone. So Carrie made reference to that 5-inch leaf litter decomposing down in a season and how important that is to our plant health. And we've really grappled with that question and that issue as a group in trying to develop content to communicate to our community. So I really feel like the leaf litter topic is you need to look at your own unique landscape and situation. So again, for me, 2 weeks ago, I was removing a dense layer of oak leaf litter that was in the 30-foot perimeter around my structure, and also from around a propane tank, because I live in a very high fire severity zone, directly abutting the wildland with a very high risk of fire. So we each need to make our own personal decisions. Optimally, you're implementing that 0 to 5 Ember defense zone with no organic materials. Optimally, you're then creating your islands of lower than 3 feet, planting groups separated by hardscape in your 5 to 30 foot zone, and then extending that concept in your 30 to 100 foot zone with inclusion of more trees and shrubs. I do also want to note that it is very important, and in Sonoma County, it is a county code requirement to keep any annual grasses or weeds mowed to 4 inches. And then you also want to make sure, if you've brought, for example, a wood pile closer to your home during winter for ease of access for firewood, for heat, you want to make sure that those wood piles are moved out to the 30 to 100 foot zone during fire season with nothing combustible located near that pile. Okay, so for just a few more design ideas, I know how expensive it can be to consider incorporation of these hardscape elements, especially looking into, the 100 feet around your home. These pictures show drain rock as a pathway and a break between plant islands, which is a kind of a more economical alternative, but I think still looks really beautiful, and also provides opportunity for water to infiltrate into the soil. Here's a picture that shows habitat support. Both Carrie and Saxon did a great job talking about why it's so important for us to be providing habitat and supporting biodiversity. Some beautiful native shrubs, Spiralcia ambigua, apricot mallow, some beautiful ceanothus, Salvia sonamensis, again, with some nice hardscape elements, whether it's this built up wall or separated plantings with wood mulch between them. And a little bit more design inspiration. Here's a really nice flagstone pathway that's bisecting some planting areas. Not a lot of woody plant materials. There's a really nice small specimen tree in here, some nice spacing between the plantings, and some mulch in that 30 to 100 foot zone. So Saxon also touched on this point. A swale can be a really great way to break up planting areas. He had some beautiful pictures that showed some swales in his presentation. Also helps to slow water during a rainstorm event, to spread it, sink it, and store it into the soil water bank. So a really nice design feature to help introduce more hardscape into your landscape. And then I wanted to just share a couple of pictures. I talked earlier about ensuring that you remove any wooden fence or gate that's attached to your home. Here's some design ideas for alternatives for wood fences if you want to expand on continuing to remove wood fencing around your property. Okay, mulch.
Excuse me, Mimi. Time check.
Thank you very much. I'm wrapping up shortly. There is mulch is a really important Maintenance reducing because of weed suppression and water conservation application for our sustainable landscape. But wood mulches are organic, and as such, those combustible materials can transmit fire. So it's recommended to not use mulch in a widespread or continuous manner. And you want to separate areas that are mulched with these materials with non-combustible and ignition-resistant materials such as concrete, gravel, rock, or that native grass lawn that I showed you earlier. So there is a scientific study by the University of Nevada at Reno and the University of California on mulch flammability. Composted wood chips demonstrate the least hazardous fire behavior overall of 8 mulch treatments that they studied. You absolutely should not include any gorilla hair or shredded bark mulch, as it's extremely susceptible to ignition from embers. And this picture on this upper picture I'm showing you, that's all shredded bark mulch directly against hedges of what is likely unirrigated and unmaintained juniper shrubs directly leading up to the house. So that's a great example of what not to do. You absolutely don't want to include any organic mulch within that 0 to 5 foot zone of the house. And again, you want to separate your composted areas with hardscape. So again, just want to highlight for what you can use between the islands of plants, composted mulch is fine in that 30 to 100 foot zone. An irrigated native grass or ground cover can be appropriate for all zones. I would not, for example, use it in my 0 to 5 foot zone, but it can be appropriate perhaps in a lower risk area and gravel or stone pathways and swales. So I'm gonna breeze really quickly through some maintenance slides. I know it's really daunting if you're not starting from a blank slate, but you have an existing mature landscape. This is an East Bay Med graphic that shows before and after with ladder fuels, no break in planted areas, and shrubs massed against the house. And then the after. There's some ongoing maintenance that's critical annually every year. There's every few years, you want to make sure you're thinning and reducing your tree canopies to remove twiggy growth. Again, maintaining your ladder fuels, cutting back ground covers and vines to remove buildup of dry stems and dead leaves, and maybe cutting back your shrubs to remove them. So key takeaways: to choose fire-resistant landscape materials, arrange your landscape plants with spacing to disrupt a fire, optimally selecting native plants to support biodiversity, maintain your landscape features, keep your plants well irrigated, healthy, and well pruned, remove any dead or dying shrubs, trees, or branches, avoid planting close to structures, especially near vents, under windows, or exposed eaves, and to continue your vigilance on the ladder fuels. In the 0 to 5 foot zone from your home, use inorganic materials such as gravel or stepping stones, remove or replace any flammable fencing materials attached to the home. 5 to 30 feet, plant an island separated by hardscape, and then same in 30 to 100 with some use of trees and shrubs. I know Cleo and Leslie will be sharing a resource list. They'll give you links to some great publications on the topic. And we do truly believe that a Firewise and sustainable landscape that incorporates beauty, safety, saves water, and supports wildlife is possible. It's very important for all of us to be doing. I hope I've given you a basic framework for evaluating and designing your own defensible space zone around your home. Start at your house and work out. Implement that 0 to 5 foot ember defense zone if you can. Plant placement and design are key, and maintenance is essential. So sorry, I ran a little bit over, but I will turn it back over to Cleo and Leslie for any Q&A that we might have time left for.
Hi, Leslie. And it seems like our questions were clustered in a few areas, particularly the mosquitoes and water features. And I think Carrie had a good answer if you would like to share it with everyone.
Yeah, and I'm glad you came back to that, because I answered it for one person and then another person had the same question. So that tells you it's probably on more people's minds. So the key with keeping mosquitoes down while having water features is that if it is a still water feature, like a bird bath or a little saucer that you have down for the lizards or whatever happens to be scooting around, is to make sure that you change the water in that every 2 days. So I have lots of birds and lots of lizards in my garden, lots of butterflies and bees that use my water features because I see them doing it. And so The ones that are still, I just go out, I dump the water into the bed. I usually plant something near it that can take a little bit of extra water. I dump it and I refill it and make sure that I'm not leaving any mosquito larvae in there. If it's a moving water feature like a fountain, the mosquitoes don't lay their eggs in those. So if it's a recirculating fountain and the water is in some motion, the mosquitoes leave that alone. So it's the still water you have to be diligent about.
Thank you, Carrie. Anyone else have anything to add? Then Leslie, if you see any questions that I missed, you can also jump in.
Okay.
Is it too late in season to now plant new small trees and shrubs?
Yes.
Yes and no. You can do it, but you are taking a risk, and you are going to have to keep a really close eye on them. And some of them aren't going to like it.
Yeah, I would say Paul would probably say no.
No.
Yes, it is too late.
Yeah, I would
so-
say more importantly for this summer, we would recommend you wait until after the fall and spring rains return before taking on new plantings at this time. And that's not, because they won't get by. It's more for consideration of what we're expecting in terms of mandatory water shortage cutbacks this summer.
For sure.
Thank you, Paul.
But you have a lot of time to plan, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yes, it's perfect planting time for your fall garden.
Arlene asks, do you know if a buttercup grassy area is okay in terms of low water use with creeping rhizomes, etc.? I didn't quite. I guess those buttercups that grow wild.
Yeah,
that
so-
shed itself.
So there's some of those that have long been existing on a steep slope on the property I live on with some vinca. And I can tell you they develop a lot of dead, all the foliage has, well, at least where I live, where it's very hot, has all died back. And so it's on my maintenance list to rake all that out. So again, you want to try to look at everything with a new lens of, from a fire perspective, what kind of dead plant material might that introduce, or what kind of receptive fuel bed might that create that I then need to be maintaining?
Okay. One of the questioners asked is, much of the beautiful landscaping is expensive to plant and maintain. Hardscaping too is expensive to build. Are there programs to help people with fewer financial resources to make the recommended changes?
Well, I can say that for those that are, closer into the urban areas and are connected to one of the retail water agencies of the partnership, most of our partners do have incentive programs for either upgrading turf areas to low water use landscapes or for upgrading irrigation system components. But often that strictly prohibits, hardscape areas if the rainwater isn't going to infiltrate and help with our groundwater recharge in the winter months. So I would just say that if you're planning to include hardscapes, give consideration for hardscapes that are dual purpose. They provide either the needed architectural addition to the garden or add a bit of a patio space or open area, but that it's done in a way and with materials that allow stormwater to infiltrate. And maybe you'll still be able to take advantage of those rebate resources.
I know that the county doesn't have, in unincorporated areas, there are no incentives for such programs, but they do have mulching programs and chipper programs. Is that right, Mimi? In some areas. Okay. There seems to be,
Excuse me,
Yeah.
Cleo, there are several more questions about the water issue. Perhaps we could lump
okay,
them all together now. Would that
all
be?
right. Would you like to do that?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. Further down, there's a question about, aren't mosquito dunks safe for birds and bees for fountains of bird baths?
Yeah, they are, but they're messy as fill in the 4-letter word. So they disintegrate. I used them for a year in this little simple Mediterranean fountain I have in the back, but they kind of disintegrate and make the water really murky, and they can clog up your pumps. So if you're using it in a fountain, so yeah, you can use them. They work. They, for those of you who don't know what they are, they release a Bacillus thuringiensis slowly, which is sometimes called BT. So that affects insect larvae. It infects them with a bacterium. So it's considered an organic control for things for larvae. But it's just as easy. If you leave a still water feature sitting without cleaning it every few days in the summer, you're going to have, and you put a dunk in it, you're going to have all sorts of fungal growth and weird stuff going on in there anyway. So even for the birds, they say it's good to have the water fresh. So
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you. There are a couple more.
Uh-huh.
Aren't water fountains and larger water features discouraged to avoid water evaporation during drought? That sounds like a Paul
They're
question.
pretty efficient if you've got a recirculating water feature. The large ones that have large open space probably evaporate more water. I swear my pool uses, just keeping my pool filled takes more water than my lawn. I mean, I don't have any lawn than my garden, but I'll let Paul address that.
Well, you touched on it, Carrie. You know, water features are required to be recirculating featured. You can't have a water feature for most of the waterways codes relative to our partners cities that doesn't recirculate water. It's actually prohibited. That said, everybody has in their landscape, you know, consideration for some lawn or some high water use plants as part of water efficient landscaping ordinance. We don't try to be overly prescriptive and prohibit absolutely someone's interest in having a small water feature, but you should do it with the recognition that it is going to be higher water use, right? For the surface area, it's a similar consideration for lawn. So just keeping it small and providing additional water sources for wildlife is not a bad thing.
There was a comment from Kim who said, I saw someone fill in their fountain with rocks and succulents so as not to waste water and reduce mosquitoes. Very pretty. I think let's go back to you, Cleo.
Okay. There was one question about non-native plants and the maintaining the habitat for, you know, the sustaining, what is it called? Eco systems. Yeah. For, can you answer that, Saxon?
Well, it's a complicated answer because there are a lot of plants that are evolved to be with very specific pollinators and insects and soil mycorrhiza. So it's, you know, some would argue only native plants and locally endemic native plants are the ones you must use. I'm a plant person and I like using plants from other parts of the world, and there are many that are adapted. I know Carrie mentioned a bulbini, which is a really good insect plant. A lot of bunch grasses are hosts for insects. Most any kind of a shrub can offer bird material. I think we need to be careful about plants that offer no services. I mean, ginkgo trees, for instance, offer almost nothing. I have one in my yard, but I wouldn't have planted today. It's just a matter of understanding there are a lot of resources out there. Doug Tallamy's work shows a lot of plants that are, he likes natives particularly, but one has to do the research, you know, and
That's
and
right.
balance that with your own location.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to say that there is some significant research out there that shows that non-native plants can provide pollen and nectar resources for native insects especially, and that very few are specific. And the ones that are really narrowly specific, it's usually not the food source that's specific, it's either the nesting or where they lay their eggs that's quite specific to a plant. But there's only a handful of species that are that narrow. The reason that evolution happens is that living organisms are highly adaptable. And so where things aren't adaptable and you want to provide those specific things like Aristolochia for the pipevine swallowtails or Sambucus for that longhorn beetle that is endangered, then feel free to use those plants as well. But as long as pollen and nectar is being provided, there's very few insects that, or berries for that matter, there's very few insects or birds that are very narrow in what they will feed on. So
We need to do your research. I mean, like monarch butterflies, just any old milkweed is not gonna help.
Asclepius, yeah.
Yeah, but you can't, the most common Asclepias in the trade is not the native. So,
Right.
it doesn't really help just to plant milkweed. So you need, do your research, figure out why it is you're planting something.
Let's get back to the question of mulch, because mulch as a water-wise tool is very important. And then people get, I guess, confused when it comes to the fire. So like Mimi said, it's the type of mulch you use and where you use it. Is there anything you guys can elaborate on that so that we can do both things, be water-wise and fire safe?
I'd like to chime in right away because I love mulch. I keep, people ask me, one of the most surprising plant that we put in the new book to me was Camellia sasanqua, because I grow it in a hot, dry place in my yard with heavy mulch, because the mulch keeps it moist and hydrated. So there's certainly no mulch anywhere near the house. And I keep my shrubs pruned. I kick up all the dead stuff out of my plants so they don't, so the mulch underneath them is not a fire hazard. I would argue it's keeping the plant hydrated and healthy. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. So like I tried to stress, everybody's going to have to make their own decision based on their own unique landscape and situation and what fire risk they're willing to assume. Absolutely. I would not suggest it be used in the 0 to 5 foot zone.
Yeah.
And don't worry in the 30 to 100. And, and if you can focus on some hardscape and, and maybe you use compost as your mulch in that 5 to 30 foot zone. Compost can make a really great mulch and water conservation tool rather than wood mulch. So it's just about, it's an incredibly important foundation of our sustainable landscapes from a water conservation and a weed suppression perspective for, helping reduce the maintenance. So we can find a way to live with it. You just need to assess your landscape to make those decisions.
Mimi, I just wanted, because a number of people asked about this around their deck areas. The 0 to 5 zone extends to the deck area, outbuildings, RVs, or any sheds.
And any structure, and that would include a deck. Thank you for pointing that out, Cleo. Really important.
So remember to keep those zones clear as well.
Yep.
This one is sort of a wide question, more philosophical. What are the ecological considerations with bringing stone products into our landscapes?
Yeah. You want to take a first stab, Carrie?
I think we have to get away from placing, good and bad values on particular landscape elements. It's all about where and how you use both rock. I mean, rock is a natural part of landscape unless you're in the desert, right? I mean, rocks and stone, you don't want to have extensive, expansive areas of just rock or just hardscape because they get extremely hot and they can add a heat effect. But there's no good or bad rock. There's no good or bad mulch. It's how you use any of it and where you use it.
Well, and I would say there's opportunities for recycling materials too, like concrete that's been broken up that can be repurposed, that can be a really beautiful finish, as a patio area. And like everything, we need to look at everything and do everything in balance.
Yeah.
And I would say that falls within that same topic. It looks like Saxon has a comment to share.
Well, I remember and still see too many gardens with the lawn rebate programs where people take out their lawn and put in crushed rock. And that is a horror story, in my humble opinion.
It's too hot.
There's no good rock or bad rock, but a front yard of crushed rock is an ecological disaster. And to do that should be a crime in horticulture. As a garden person, I mean, of course, some people have to do it, maybe, but you can put some big rocks and some little rocks in there. You can put some succulents. You can put some plants that are adapted without just taking out your lawn and putting in rock. It is not good. It doesn't help the soil. It doesn't help evapotranspiration. It doesn't help the critters. It's terrible.
Right, and if you're in Palm Desert and you have nothing but succulents and you're using crushed rock under them in that kind of a landscape that's more regionally
Yeah.
consistent, that's different than what we're talking about. But it's a little hard to get at what the person was actually asking, but it may be that they were referring to what Saxon is talking about, where we just pull out everything and put in rock because that's easier. And nobody benefits from that, including the environment.
I want to respect everybody's time. We're 10 minutes over our allotted time. We could still go on. The panelists, if you want to answer a few more questions. I think one question I would like to have answered is, and that's a really key one. Yvonne asks, for an area like a large lawn that needs to be removed, what can I do now? Layer mulch until we can plant in the fall? I think that's the right answer.
Yeah. Yeah, sheet mulching is a great thing to do right now. So you can look up sheet mulching. I'm sure your local Master Gardener program probably has an idea. You don't even have to dig the lawn out. You can just literally lay sheets of cardboard or 6 to 8 sheets of newspaper over the top of the grass, and then cover that with compost is what I would suggest, rather than covering it with just mulch right now. The compost being less combustible, and the compost then becoming a part of that soil profile underneath there. And then you may want to cut out the edge along the hardscape, the edges where the lawn was, and dig that out and fill that so that you don't end up way above grade at the concrete layer, which can cause the compost to wash off and end up in the stormwater, which is an ecological no-no. So those are really good things to do right now, and then just wait. And by fall, you should be able to just dig a hole and plant right into it.
Well, I would also suggest the question itself, they might have a large lawn they're trying to transition. First, just stop watering it.
Yeah, for sure.
Accept that brown is a color too. And if it's weed whacked back and you add a fountain or a you can just let, green is not natural summer color here for our open spaces. So learn to live with the brown. It really, it was
exactly what we did when we removed ours. We just quit watering it for a summer and let it die. And we marked out our paths. So you can mark out the paths now so that you're not mulching pathways. Mark those out, mark the areas that you want to have. And you can also install the irrigation conversion now, so that that's in place for when you're ready to plant. So those are all things you can do in advance.
And
People were concerned with the, when you sheet mulch, you have to do a lot of heavy watering, water the cardboard and such. So but that neglect is a wonderful way, unless you're worried about your neighbors.
And I can't not plug our UC Master Gardener program of Sonoma County Garden Sense program.
Correct.
We have trained consultants in low water use plant selection, irrigation conversion from spray to drip, sheet mulching. You can go to our UC Master Gardener of Sonoma County website, click on the Garden Sense logo, and you can get a scheduled visit of a pair of Master Gardener consultants who come out and help you understand what you can do to help remove your lawn and move to a more appropriate low water use, summer dry, appropriate climate selection.
I think we tried to answer as many of the questions, and want to give people an opportunity to capture some of the links, but we were also going to be emailing you, if you since you registered for the webinar, in a couple of days, PDF with a number of the links and a number of follow-ups on the questions that you had. And here are some of the QR codes here on Saxon's webpage is the summerdry.com, and this is the QR code. If you put your iPhone on it, it will capture the link to the webpage. The next one is Eco-Friendly Garden Tour. We already did that. Then the next one is Water Use Classifications, Carrie's, the WUCALs. Did I pronounce it correct, Carrie?
There's no right way to pronounce that acronym. There's just the way you pronounce it. And I pronounce it Woogles, but I don't think it matters.
Wookles. And then finally, our webpage where you can find information on sheet mulching. And you can also find, if you're a vegetable gardener, we also have on how to garden, how to do low water vegetable gardening. We will also provide you those links on the PDF and also links to our Garden Sense program and our YouTube channel. I want to thank everyone for their quite informative and substantive presentations. And any final words from any of our panelists?
Well, I'm just saying, this is a clinic. Love having Mimi and Carrie's expertise. I feel like I'm just a fluff on the side. This is really informative, and I'm looking forward to keeping the link.
And I was flattered to follow your presentation, Saxon. And seriously, I'm coming for some of those pictures for my presentation.
Saxon, the thing about what you do with your photographs is you take us away from what are images of this traditional English garden, Euro-based garden, and we could look at it from our climate and our perspective of what is sustainable here in our local.
Well, we need to redefine what we think is beauty. And
exactly.
That's fundamentally getting outside and looking at, it's supposed to be brown in the summertime. I mean, it can be really lovely if you understand the plants that are adapted to it. And I would say we're in a tough situation right now because it is so dry, and it's going to be really tough to take a walk outside in August. But right now, it's lovely outside. It's turning brown. There's a lot we can learn just by studying nature and trying to bring that into our own lives, in our own homes.
And also there's a certain smell to California landscape, that sage smell that when you go out there, you go, oh, I'm home. Paul, as our sponsor, do you want to say something to close or?
Well, again, I just would like to thank everybody for their participation and willingness to help bring added value to the Eco-Friendly Garden Tour today. And for those participants still participating in this webinar, I would encourage you next to visit that link to savingwaterpartnership.org. Look for the Eco-Friendly Garden Tour. We've got some great videos and additional inspiration awaiting you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Happy, sustainable, resilient gardens. Thank you.
Thank you all.